Thank you everybody for joining. I'm gonna go ahead and get started then. So welcome to a free mixology course by Horseations, where we're gonna explore the many topics of the mixology, cocktail, and the bartending world. So a drink will be mixed and conversations to be had. Let's get to it. Feel free to type your comments or questions in the chat anytime. I'm gonna go ahead and answer that. Feel free to interrupt. This is the fourth class where we're going to talk about the Martini, a very classic, iconic cocktail you must know from everywhere. We even have a cocktail glass named after this cocktail. So, shaken, not stirred. You probably heard of this familiar, very famous line by the spy 007, James Bond. April 13th actually marks the anniversary of Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond's books, of Casino Royale. It's the first book that was written back in 1953. So Ian Fleming served in the Royal Navy, and he has personal experience in espionage during World War II. And so it leveraged him to start this book. And if I remember correctly, in the 7th chapter of Casino Royale, he orders a Vesper. If you've seen the movie Casino Royale, you're probably familiar about how James Bond goes ahead and orders the Vesper or Vesper Lynn. And I'm trying to remember. Yes, he says 3 measures of Gordon, 1 of vodka, half a measure of Quina Lillet, shake it over ice, and then add a thin slice of lemon peel. And it was apparently a very popularized cocktail back in the day. It was just so much flair, and then everyone just started drinking it. Now, he names this cocktail after his deceased lover in the novel, Vesper Lynn, whose name means evening. So I'm gonna go ahead and let's start by making that right now. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my countertop. Great, so let's start with the Vesper. So it's a shaken cocktail. We're gonna just do it exactly what the novel says. First, we're gonna add 3 measures of Gordon. So basically 3 ounces. I actually do not drink Gordons quite often. So I just went ahead, I hope you can see it, it focuses. I go ahead and just bought these little tiny bottles. They're pretty cute, but 2 bottles exactly measures 3 ounces. So we're gonna go ahead and just pour that straight in. So you just use any London dry gin. You don't have to use Gordon's. Gordon's is just what James Bond used in the novel. Next, we're gonna use 1 ounce of vodka. I myself have Grey Goose. You're probably maybe familiar with this brand. It's a vodka from France. It's considered higher quality. However, fun fact about vodka, a lot of purists will say there's differences in the taste of vodka. I totally agree with that. It's just I'm not advanced enough, my palate's not advanced enough to taste the nuances. However, a big part about vodka flavor is 60% of that vodka is water because it's 40% ABV. So where that water comes from is actually very critical to your the vodka's taste. Just a note there. So I'm just gonna go ahead. I already pre-measured it. I just feel ridiculous pouring from a large bottle like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and put that in. And then afterwards, we're gonna add the Quina Lillet. Now, Quina Lillet, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's actually, so before I get into this bottle right here, Quina Lillet is actually discontinued. You cannot find it in stores anymore. You might be able to find it in your local bar, craft cocktail bar if they stock it. They actually rebranded it and named it Lillet Blanc. You can find that in stores. However, the thing about Lillet Blanc is it's different from the original Quina Lillet because it no longer has quinine. Quinine is a familiar flavor you might recognize from tonic water. So to replicate that, bartenders, mixologists tried different aperitifs from all over the world, and they narrowed it down. This is a brand new bottle. They narrowed it down to this one, Cocchi Americano, which is an Italian aperitif that does contain quinine. It does closely resemble the flavors of Quina Lillet. So things about vermouth, you always want to remember, once you open it, you're always going to store it in the fridge. It's just like wine. So half a measure in. Put that to the side. And then since it's shaken, we're going to go ahead and add our ice. And another thing too is we're gonna grab our martini glass, because usually a martini glass, you want to serve it when the martini glass is ice cold. So since I don't have it in the refrigerator, I'm gonna go ahead and just chill it with water and ice. This actually nifty trick is very handy when you're trying to quick chill the glassware. So you just go ahead and add water, and it'll just quickly chill it down. You just set that to the side while you go ahead and shake up this cocktail. So it's gonna get a little loud because I'm gonna be shaking it. Usually shaking for about 10 seconds reaches perfect dilution. So we're gonna go ahead and pop that open and strain that into the glass after we pour out the contents. So I'm just gonna give this a quick stir, just to cool it down a little bit, dump the ice out, and pour that straight in. Right. And to finish this off, we're gonna go ahead and add our thin slice of lemon peel as requested by Mr. Bond. So we're gonna take a Y peeler and just try to get as little of the white pith as possible. I'm just gonna make it a little pretty. So what you can do is get really creative with your cocktail garnishes, but I'm gonna make it simple, just do a twist. There we go. Just like this, so you can see it. So I cut it in like a, I forgot what the shape is called. Gotta go back to elementary school math. You just go ahead and express the oils over the Vesper and drop it in. And there you go. This is the Vesper or Vesper Martini. And you might notice that it is a bit cloudy. That is from the shaking. I will go ahead and answer the whole debate of shaken versus stirred in a second after I taste this wonderful drink. Very interesting. Of course, you taste the gin up front because it's a very gin-heavy cocktail. The vodka doesn't really do much, to be honest. I don't taste enough of the Coca Americano. Yeah, not really. It's mostly the gin. I think the ratios. But again, this is a fictional cocktail created from a fictional character. So we'll leave it at that. But because of the popularity of this cocktail, you get a lot of people drinking it. So let's go ahead and talk about shaken versus stirred. You might be wondering this in cocktail bars. Why do some cocktails get shaken? Why do some get stirred? So what do you think happens when you shake a cocktail? Well, you saw it yourself. If you notice the drink, it's actually very cloudy because when you shake a drink, you aerate, you provide some aeration, you add bubbles to the cocktail. And so it's perfect for cocktails such as the daiquiri, sidecar, cocktails that have juice, dairy, or egg white. Those are usually shaken because it aerates, provides froth into the drink, and it dances off the tongue, the flavors. Now, what that does to a martini though, is you don't get the full flavor of the gin. When you drink it, you taste kind of like tiny air bubbles. And so to get the full flavor, you want to stir it because you want to be gentle with the spirit forward cocktails. And so cocktails such as the Manhattan, an old fashioned, a martini ideally should be stirred because you want to get the full velvety texture when you drink that cocktail. And so that pretty much is the argument between shaken versus stirred. Now, there is a third method. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called thrown cocktails. It's actually when, try to do a demonstration here, it's when cocktails are thrown. They're poured, they're go ahead and thrown back into the cup, thrown back in here. And so they're basically poured back and forth. It's called throwing a cocktail. It's more popular in Europe. You might see it in craft cocktails bars somewhere else in the world, but most of the time it's like another theatrical performance. I believe James Bond or Ian Fleming chose the Martini or the Vesper to be shaken because it's definitely more theatrical. You can imagine while you're stirring a drink, it has to be stirred for at least 20 seconds. You're standing there doing this. The only thing that's moving is your hand. It's not as entertaining as people would think back in the day. And so a lot of times people loved seeing the bartender shake, do these crazy movements with the shaker. And so I believe that is why shaken was chosen. So that debate aside, I would say just drink how you like it. You might like it a different way from somebody else. No matter, it's your drink, it's your preference. Feel free to enjoy. And so let me talk about Martini and the rise to popularity. Before that, let me just take another quick sip. Also, another thing about shaken cocktails, you do see a little ice shards that got through the strainer. Of course, it's hard to tell with the camera, but that adds extra dilution to the drink too. Fun fact, some might argue that James Bond chose to shake his cocktail because it had ice chips, so it diluted the cocktail, add more water content, so he wouldn't be drunk on the job. But hey, he's always drinking. So the Martini, in the beginning, it called for actually equal parts vermouth and gin. So it's dry vermouth. So 50-50. It's hard to believe, but actually vermouth, it used to be 2 parts vermouth to 1 part gin. Hard to believe, right? It's actually because vermouth is a wine that has been infused with a lot of herbs and a lot of, it's very bitter, but it was used as a herbal remedy for certain ailments back in the day, and people treated it like medicine. And so people just added gin to it and then created this cocktail to make it easier to drink, to pour down, right? Adding gin to make it easier to down, right? That's interesting. So actually it was the bartender's job to ask the customer how much vermouth and how much spirit that they wanted. And martinis back in the day were actually associated with these people called club men. These people were, if the name implies, just very posh, very wealthy, and like it was just advertised, the martini, as a very wealthy cocktail, and it was associated as a status symbol. If you drank a martini, if you could afford it, it means you were rich. I believe, if I remember correctly, martinis back in the day were 30 cents each, when the hourly rate, I believe, was like 25 cents or so. So it was just really expensive. I might be wrong on that, but that's just based on my memory. But it was really expensive to order just a single martini. And so martinis did grow in popularity because people, of course, everyone wants to look rich, right? Everyone looks to look fancy. And so martinis just grew in popularity because it was featured in newspapers, featured in ads everywhere, posters. It was also, when movies came out, it was featured in movies. You had characters drinking the martini. Of course, like James Bond was a perfect example. He drank other cocktails too, don't forget, Negronis, such like that. And so it got more and more popular, especially during Prohibition too, when gin was super popular, or bathtub gin, I could be specific. A bathtub gin, fun fact, was gin distilled in a bathtub because during Prohibition, it was illegal to have distilleries and to serve alcohol because Prohibition basically prohibited alcohol. And so because of that, more and more people changed the way the martini was drunken, because it started off with 2 parts vermouth to 1 part gin. Then it turned to 50-50. And then suddenly more people added gin to it. And so it became a dry martini as you know it now. And so it went from a wet martini to dry. Then suddenly there was actually a point that the martini was actually drunken on the rocks. That's kind of bizarre, right? On the rocks. You would dilute out the gin, dilute out everything in there. But it happened because people wanted to make this cocktail more palpable. They wanted to try it, but some could not handle the harshness of the gin, the vermouth, the bitter taste. And so, especially during Prohibition, when more and more people were moving towards a sweeter palate. And so it changed also to vodka instead of gin. You've probably heard of the vodka martini, because back in the day, people were like, oh, I can't handle gin. It's just too strong for me. Let's add vodka, the tasteless spirit. And so there, the vodka martini was born. And then you also get the dirty martini because somebody's idea was, let's add olive brine into it. And then we get the dirty martini. And then you've probably heard of the early 21st century, all the flavored martinis out there. The apple teeny, the melon teeny, the orange teeny, the pomegranate teeny, any type of teeny you can think of all the fruit flavors, syrups everywhere. And it just went wild. Everyone just was on the craze of the sweet teeny craze. And so you can imagine back then, all the history of the martini was kind of lost through all this transition, all these changes of this martini cocktail. Not to mention too, equal parts vermouth, equal parts gin. Should I put an onion garnish on there? Should I put a lemon garnish on there? Should I put no garnish on there? Should I put an olive garnish? There's just so many options with the martini. It's ridiculous. And it's a simple cocktail, just 2 ingredients. Well, 3 if you technically add bitters to it if you chose to, but that's another choice too. Bitters, no bitters. And so everyone was so confused, but they were just drinking how they liked it, which is totally fine. However, in November 2002, cocktail historian David Wondrich decided, hey, I want to remind everybody what a real martini is. And so he hosted an event partnered with Tanqueray Gin to do a martini off, which is basically a lot of bartenders were invited, a lot of mixologists where they would just mix a lot of martinis together and then do taste tests. And of course, to this day, the very dry martini won, which is basically 2 parts gin to half an ounce of dry vermouth. However, interestingly enough, the lost 50-50 ratio martini left a very lasting impression on all the judges and everybody that was in attendance. And bartenders that had no idea about this 50-50 ratio started taking it up again and started popularizing it and saying, hey, look at me. I'm so cool because I know the true history behind the martini. I'm like really hip. And then everyone started doing it, that actually this no longer became like a historical cocktail. It became a snobby cocktail because people were drinking it and saying, and just showing off like, hey, I know everything about the martini, you don't. And so people, had mixed feelings about it, but in 2017, another event hosted by punch.com, the website, 27 martinis were created by several bartenders out there, and then they were all blind taste tested. And interestingly enough, the 50-50 martini were all eliminated in the first round, just gone. Maybe that dry vermouth was just too much to handle for everyone's palate. But that just comes to prove that maybe people were just drinking that 50-50 martini just to be cool, which kind of makes sense. You want to look cool, right? And so with that being said, the dry martini seems to be the most ideal. So I'm a little thirsty from all that talking, so I'm going to go ahead and take another sip. Quite good. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and make our second cocktail after that brief history of the martini, its rise to popularity. There's so much history behind it. I just gave a short snippet, but here's another interesting fact about the martini you might or might not have known. I was surprised when I learned this too. Why have a martini glass instead of a Manhattan glass? You've probably heard of the popular cocktail, the Manhattan. So someone asked, I don't drink Gordon's, but what is my preferred gin? So I can actually pause here and actually show off. I actually have a lineup of gin right here of the different kinds of gins out there. So first off, I have Beefeater, or standard London dry gin. I love this gin for cocktails because it's good enough by itself, but it's also not so strong that it overpowers the drink that you're making, the cocktail. But actually, if you would say my favorite, it's a tough choice because there's so many gins out there that you can try. I would highly recommend Hendrick's. I know some people don't like cucumber. This is a gin popular for being distilled with cucumbers and rose petals. Feel free to try it. It's considered a new age gin because gin tends to deter a lot of people because of the strong juniper berries. That strong taste that you get is from the juniper. And so new age gin uses less of that. Aviation gin, If you love Ryan Reynolds, Mr. Deadpool, this gin is actually pretty good as well. It's a little spicier, but it's also another new age gin. And then lastly, I'm just gonna show one more before I get to the Manhattan, because this gin, or Genever, I can make another class and teach about this one as well. Genever is a different category of gin where it is, this is probably the sweetest and probably the most smooth, grainy gin out there, type of gin out there, the Genevers. Old Tom gin is another one, but this one is Bols Genever from Amsterdam. This one is very, very good. So thank you for asking that. I'm gonna go ahead and continue and make the Manhattan now. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So the Manhattan is the Martini's older cousin. Believe it or not, was created first before the actual Martini. And if you look at the recipe for a Manhattan, it's actually very, very similar because it's 2 parts rye whiskey, which is similar to the 2 parts gin. And then you also get the vermouth. The Martini uses dry vermouth. However, the Manhattan uses a sweet vermouth. So it's very similar. And the Manhattan, believe it or not, back in the day, it was hard to distinguish the Manhattan from the Martini. Right nowadays, you know the Martini as being a clear cocktail. But then, turn on the chat, sorry. But then the Manhattan is a dark cocktail because it has whiskey. But then back in the day, whiskey wasn't aged for that long, so it didn't have the oak flavors or the coloring from the oak in the cocktail. So it was definitely like more white. And also dry vermouth was more like clear, not really clear, but more like greenish kind of color. It wasn't like that. It was actually more red back in the day because it was infused with so many different types of herbs. And so the Martini, the Manhattan, interesting enough, sorry about that. The Manhattan is the older cousin. The Martini is just a riff-off of the Manhattan. Now, I actually don't know why it's called a Martini glass, but it's probably because of the popularity of the Martini that you get a glass named after it. So let's start with the Manhattan. So first off, we're gonna go ahead and add 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. So let me show off the label here. You're probably very familiar with this brand. This brand is your standard aromatic bitters to add. 2 dashes. You can add more too. It depends on how much you, or not how much, I apologize. It's more about like the flavor, how much of the bitters you like. And then next, we're gonna go ahead and add our sweet vermouth. So the sweet vermouth I'm gonna be using is called, let's see a bit of focus here. Come on, camera. All right, the Carpano Antica Formula, which is a sweet vermouth from Italy, and it is very strong. Now, the reason why the flavors are very strong is because this is infused with heavy wormwood. It's probably the most bitter herb out there. It's also what's used for absinthe. This is used because there's sweeter ones out there, such as like it's more smooth, not really like harsh tasting. Not saying this isn't sweet, but this flavor is needed from the Carpano instead of a Dolin sweet vermouth, for example, because of the whiskey I'm about to use that is quite strong, and we need a sweet vermouth that's able to withstand the flavors of that rye whiskey to make that balance. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce that rye whiskey now, and I use Rittenhouse rye whiskey, bottled in bond. You might be wondering what bottled in bond stands for. It was a very old law enacted back in the day, probably over 200 years ago, if my memory serves me correctly. Basically, this means that under law, this whiskey or this bottle that you're getting was distilled in one distillery, bottled under one season. And it's very strict laws, which makes it bottled in bond, and it's always 50% ABV. And so with that, and there's no coloring added, there's all these laws behind it. And so you know you're getting quality, or it's made under the law. So there's very strict regulation behind it. And so Rittenhouse is very bold flavors, very spicy. If you're able to find it in your stores, please get it. I highly recommend it. My bottle was very affordable, only $25 US dollars. And so with those bold flavors, that's why we use Carpano to withstand the flavors. And so with that, we're gonna go ahead and add our ice. Pop it in. And so we're gonna stir for 20 seconds. So feel free to count if you would like, but you can see how this is probably the least entertaining part of people sitting at the bar. Or maybe this is the time for you to chat up the bartender and say like, hey, how's it going? Like, what's you putting in the drink? What's interesting? What's new? But you can see that shaking has a lot more flair, a lot more things going on. I'm literally just moving my wrist right now. That's all I'm doing. So we have to stir this for 20 seconds to achieve the proper dilution. Oh yes, I agree. So someone commenting stirring is soothing. I actually very much agree. And I love stirring by Japanese bartenders. It's amazing what they do because they stir without a sound. I was still clinking the glass here and there, but they make it so beautifully. And we go ahead and pour in our drink. And again, don't forget, we always taste with our eyes. So we have to add a garnish. So you probably saw this bottle or jar sitting behind the scenes. Our Luxardo maraschino cherries. I would advise not, I always tell people like you eat what you eat, you drink what you drink, but I would highly advise not to purchase the bright red maraschino cherries because that's a lot of corn syrup, very artificial flavors in there. And it's just not natural to go into, you make a beautiful cocktail and then you add like a very candied out maraschino cherry. I don't think I personally don't think that's a good idea. So we're gonna actually use this one, which is marinated with maraschino liqueur. And so we're getting really legit great flavors with this cherry. If you have some friends that love making cocktails, you can actually buy some. If Costco is available in your area, you can actually buy from Costco. And they have a big tub you can split amongst friends. It actually makes it cheaper than the small one that you see right here. And so we're just gonna go ahead and garnish with the maraschino cherry, just like that. And there you go. This is your Manhattan cocktail. And so I'm gonna go ahead, let's have a taste. I love the Manhattan. I actually prefer the Manhattan over the, not saying I love gin too, but I actually prefer the Manhattan over it because just, I don't know, it's a very bold flavor to me. And I just love it a lot. Everyone's personal preference, right? And so with that, we only have a minute left. I'm here to answer any questions that you guys might have, any interesting comments, any feedback you have, feel free to give it to me. Feel free to type it in the chat. I'm here to stay for another maybe 2 minutes or so if you would like to chat a little bit more about the Martini. Thank you very much everyone for joining. I hope you learned something new today about the Martini, the Manhattan, a little bit about James Bond. Not really. He's a fictional character. Do what you will with that information. But I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to join our next month's class, which is I'm going to mix up some bourbon whiskey cocktails for Mother's Day. Hopefully you can impress your mother with 3 cocktails. I'm going to be making 3 cocktails for Mother's Day. So look forward to that. Sign up on Eventbrite. And so with that, I'm gonna go ahead and sip on my Manhattan. Feel free to comment if you have any questions, comments. Of course, yes. You're welcome. Yeah, so much. There's so much history behind a Martini. It's amazing. Yes. Yes, of course. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining, everybody. A lot of interesting things with the Martini. A lot of stories to be had. So you can talk to your fellow cocktail enthusiasts about the information given today. All right. It's probably hard for me to drink the It's probably hard for me to drink the Vesper now because rye whiskey definitely is bolder in flavor, so it's probably going to be overpower my palate. I'm just going to drink it anyways, just see what it tastes like now. So the thing about gin is just like heavy on the botanicals. So it really depends on what botanicals the gin distiller uses, and what gets the flavor of the gin. And so that's why I highly, highly recommend Hendrick's if you love cucumber and rose flavors. Very, very good. Okay, well, I mean, it's 2 minutes past 12:30. Thank you for joining. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I'll catch you guys next time, hopefully next month.